So this was a pretty incredible journey for me. Many years ago, I said I was going to make a bell on the podcast. And my buddy Mike, who is a member here at the New York Explorers Club, invited me to make a bell for a memorial service to honor two of their members that had died recently. And the New York Explorers Club was started in 1904 to promote science and global exploration. And Mike, my friend, he's a member there, and this is such a beautiful place. It's so many memories, so many mementos. And this is me and Mike with the finished bell. That's Mike Dubno. I'll post a link to a video that Jocko did about Mike and his machine shop below. And this is the bell in the final bell of 4 that I made in the final place. And this ceremony was to honor Hamish, Harding, and P.H. Nargolet, 2 gentlemen that died on the Titan submersible. They were members here at the club. Here you see Victor Vescovo, one of the esteemed members of the club. Tradition at the club is to say a kind word about the fallen member, take a shot, smash that shot glass in the fireplace, and then ring the bell. And this is the bell that I made. And the journey begins here. What you're looking at is 2-inch thick foam, polyurethane foam. I don't know what the weight is or anything. It was a bunch of scrap pieces my friend Tom left here. He used my CNC to make a sign, and these are scrap pieces he left behind, and I knew they would be useful for something. And then a couple of weeks later, Mike got in touch with me and said, "Hey, do you remember that bell you keep talking about that you want to make? I have a good purpose for it." So I started with this styrofoam, and I did a little bit of research on different ways of making the bell. I know most importantly we had to start with a good form, and I started with this styrofoam because it's malleable. I knew that if I had a problem I could quickly fix it, or if I had an explosion on the lathe. And this is Total Boat fairing compound. I used it like adhesive between the blocks, and you mix up part A and part B until it turns into a consistent creamy color. It turns into peanut butter, essentially. That's the thickness of it. And you squish it together, and in a couple of hours it hardens. Now, technically speaking, why wouldn't I use glue? Why wouldn't I use, say, for instance, like a PVA glue or a Type-On? That glue joint becomes harder than the material, and then when you work on it, you sand it, the glue joints tend to stand out from the surface, and they wear away, cut, sand. They're more dense, and so you have a hard time getting a nice smooth face. And that's something I know from experience. Using this fairing compound, it dries almost to the same consistency as that dense foam, and I figured I'd give it a try, and it worked perfectly. Everything sanded and cut cleanly, so you don't have these raised joints. It all became one nice fair surface. And now what you're looking at is a blunt lathe I bought on Facebook Marketplace a couple of years ago. Paid $1,000 for it. It's 12 feet long. It is a pattern maker's lathe, which is the reason why it has a cross feed and a cross slide and a cross feed, so you can do precision cuts. Back in the day, anything made out of cast iron would have been made out of wood first, and you needed precision lathe making tools like this to be able to get it. Now here you see I'm trying to do a traditional bowl making technique where I'm going in, but I'm leaving that stem deep in the middle. And it gets precarious as we get down to the bottom because anything could go crazy and break. And I decided to use foam. You'll see in some of the pictures. Years ago when I first thought I was going to make a bell, I made it out of wood, and it's kicking around the shop. But then I kind of lost my gusto. But with this project, for this purpose and this mission statement that Mike said, let's make a bell in honor of these 2 gentlemen, I said, let me start from scratch. Let me start over, and that's why I decided to use the foam. Yeah! Now, to make this bell special, it had to be inscribed with the gentlemen's names and the date, and practical thinking had me believing that this would be the easiest way to go. I laser cut out of cardboard, and I applied it with PVA glue there. I applied it to the bell itself, and I thought to myself, lost wax technique is really the way to go. And here you see just inventing a couple of methods to get the font on there on a curve, because it is on a curve, and pulling the letters out of the cardboard and then putting tape on it. And then once the glue dries, I'm able to pull the tape off. I'm just showing you my journey. None of this worked out. At the end of the day, the raised letters on the bell did not work out the way I expected, but I had to go through this process to get to where I ended up. I still learned a lot. And on one side it says the Titanic, and the other side it says the Titan, which is the name of the ship. And then I spray painted it with white gloss paint just to pull all of the aspects of it together. So when I go to the next step, which is making a mold, I didn't have any small little cracks or anything for the molding material to get caught under. And so here you see I'm just using Mold Max 60, which is this more harder, kind of feels like vulcanized rubber. I ultimately didn't love it. It had a high heat resistance, which is why I got it, but the rubber itself is way too rigid. And it took me about 1.5 gallons to get this full mold. And you notice I used the clear plexiglass. If you're going to do any mold making like this, clear plexiglass is great. Do you see how I've taped the joints together with just packing tape? And the good thing about that is I can take all those pieces off, scrape them down, and then hot glue them back into place. And it took a minute. This is much more dense rubber than your average silicone. Like I said, it's kind of more like a vulcanized, almost like car tire rubber. And it also breaks easy. And as me pulling it apart, you see it just cracked and ripped. And so there I was stuck with that. But that was fine because I was ultimately able to puzzle it back together, wrap it up with some packing tape, and then mix up some lost wax. Here you see this is jeweler's wax. This is going to be baked out of the mold that I make with jeweler investment. And here you go. See, this is a sturdy wax. You just heat it up. It only takes like 100 and maybe 20, 130 degrees to get it to turn to liquid. And I heat up the mold so that it doesn't cool while I pour it in. And when I pour it in, let it cool down. This is me just working in the dark, looking at some YouTube videos, taking in some ideas, thinking this is going to be a walk in the park. This is going to be a breeze. Everything's going so well. Here you see the bell. Wow, that opens up nice and beautifully. I use a compressed air to blow it out the bottom. I just shoot some compressed air under the lip and it pops right off of the core, which would be that big piece inside. So now it's time to make the mold itself, the mold that's going to get the brass poured into it. Again, since I saved the walls of the silicone, I'm able to use them again, and here I'm just using some hot glue, and this works great. You could pop it apart, scrape it, and reuse it again. And what you're looking at is not necessarily plaster, it's called investment, and it's meant to be used as mold when you do mold making material, when you do jewelry design. And I'm cleaning it up, and it's still very, very wet. It needs to be baked. You bake it in the kiln, and you bake out the moisture, and of course you bake out the wax. So here you see I've baked the wax out completely, and now this is going to be 1, 2, 3. We melt some brass, we pour the brass in there, and everything works out great. Now Mike has a machine shop in the city, and in his machine shop he just made a beautiful vintage Ori, which is a planetary gear system that shows off the planetary systems. And this is all the scrap from Mike's machine shop, and we thought it would be a nice tribute to make the bell out of this beautiful piece he made, which is probably going to also end up in the Explorers Club. And this is my forge, and there's me and Glenn putting the pieces in there. And we thought we had it made. We figured, we're going to go to lunch, let the mold cool off. Everything was going to work out perfectly. What I didn't know is that that mold that I made needed to be baked for days. I only baked it for a day or two, and then it was about a week later when these guys came over to make this casting, and the mold still had lots and lots and lots of moisture in it. And you'll see what happens when you pour molten metal into a moist mold. I mean, it was dry to the touch. It wasn't like I felt the moisture coming off it, and if you sat it on the table, it didn't leave a wet mark like some plaster does. It felt dry to the touch, but when I looked at the schedule, I did not bake it according to schedule. Now watch what happens. Molten brass into water, and we have what amounts to an explosion. Now it doesn't look bad on camera, but when you're 1 foot away from it, it went crazy. This is another angle of the same shot, and it was scary, and I was like, let's give it a try, let's keep going. And I think I walked back in. Oh, maybe that was the second pour. We poured twice, if you go back and notice. The turkeys were all curious what just happened. And I said, well, maybe something's in there. Let's give it a try. I know it wasn't going to be a successful cast, but we broke open the plaster or the investment, and there was a full bell in there. It just did not have the texture we needed. It had an altogether different texture, which was really cool, but not a success. Now, once we hosed off the bell and we power washed it, it was basically Swiss cheese. You could vaguely see some of the font on there, but it was not a successful cast. Here you can see it up close. It looks really cool, but it's definitely a failure. And I learned that moisture in the mold is your enemy. Now, you would assume I would have known that, but I also didn't realize there was still moisture in the mold. We learned the hard way. Okay, in this case, this is about 3 weeks later. Me and Mike did a lot of research, and Glenn, we read up on what we were supposed to do. We were supposed to take this mold, put it in a kiln, bake out the wax, but also go through a series of heat treatments, taking the mold all the way up to 1700 degrees and back and up and back and up and back until everything is baked completely out. So in this case, you notice in the kiln I made 2 molds. And in the process of baking them, they started to crack a little bit. That's why I have wire around everything to keep them all kind of together. Now we take this mold out. It's baked up to about 1500 degrees. We put it on the bricks. And we go to pour. And there's a hairline crack in it. And I say to Mike, what do we think about the hairline crack? And he goes, well, it's too late now. Let's just pour it and see what happens. Which is true. There's not much we could have done. But we prepare. We get our casting materials. We did not remelt the original bell. I thought it was too cool as a step in the process of learning, so I saved it. So this is just a bunch of new brass, bullet shells, other parts from Mike's shop. And look at this. Everything's going great. We anticipated the blow up, no blow up. It's pouring in beautifully. And bang.
Oh, wow, it's leaking out like that.
The mold cracks completely through, and all of our brass pours out. Mold number 2. I think this investment just isn't the right process for this. We had another mold in the kiln to try another shot, and we all agreed that there's hairline cracks in that too. It's just going to be a waste of time. This is the only piece of the bell we were able to save. Back to the drawing board.
To you.
Well, me, Mike, and Glenn agreed. Scraped the letters off of the original form. I sanded the letters completely off of the form, and we used it as just a regular bell. Now you realize what we're doing is a sand casting mold. We could not have the font on the bell because it wouldn't pull out of the draft. It wouldn't pull through. It would get caught up. Just not the practical, correct method. So we eliminated the font, made a top mold, a bottom mold. This is more traditional sand casting, is a little bit more simple to understand, and we assumed had a lot less pitfalls. Now, I always say if you want to do anything, learn how to do anything, you got to do it several times. So now this is me and Mike and Glenn making this mold. It ended up becoming extremely heavy. We made the exterior, and then we made the core, and then we did a little bit of research on what to make as far as the pour. I don't know what that would be called, the sprue maybe. And we scraped out what would be the sprue. We scraped out the fill spot on top. And you'll notice I'm vacuuming away everything that becomes loose so it doesn't fall back inside the mold. This was late on that same day. We wanted to try and get something done. Mike was up from the city. We didn't want to waste the day, so we went down this road. I happened to have the red sand casting material. The proper name is Daft Clay or Petrabond, more commonly known as Petrabond. It's an oily sand that stays in the shape you bang it into. You notice we really have to compound the mold so it remains in that shape. Once you pour molten metal into it, it burns, so you scrape out the burnt stuff, but you could use it again. As far as our materials, again, we're using bullet shells and scrap from Mike's workshop. We remelted a little bit of the last failure, but not a lot of it because it had rocks and stones stuck in it. And now we are being super careful You got to pull out the crucible, try not to spill it, try not to pour it on your feet. And now here we go. Now I made a fatal mistake. You'll notice we're pouring into the hole that is on the extreme right, and I could not see our vent hole, which is being hidden. Not in this shot, but while I was standing over it, I couldn't see the vent hole, so we didn't know how much material we were pouring in. Amateur mistake. And then I said, wait a minute, look, it's not filled in. I think we go back in and pour it more right into the vent hole, which is definitely an amateur mistake, but you learn, you do, and you learn. We knew we had something. I noticed that the vent hole wasn't completely filled in, so I was afraid that we might have a bell with no top. But when I made my styrofoam former, I made the top almost an inch thick, which is too thick. But it was enough to save us because we didn't fill in the cavity completely, but there was still enough material to finish the top of the bell. It rings.
Ow!
And now I'm having some fun. The casting is on the lathe. I tried some cutting heads, but it was too precarious. The bell wasn't round enough. And I realized the bell doesn't need to be perfectly round. It could have a couple of inconsistencies as far as its concentricity, because it's just a bell. It's not a gear in a machine. And using the grinder on the lathe was really the best technique. Some files. It was really just all hand work. There was no way I can get at it with the cutting tools. It pulled off of the lathe a few times. And now here I'm just using a Scotch-Brite disc. Now it's time to apply the font. And the only thing I could think to do would be to etch it in, electro etch it. Now I laid it on there. These are vinyl cuts, and I press them down hard. A couple of months ago I made an axe and I electro etched in the Black Raven logo, and that came out pretty good. And so here, do you see, this is just vinyl cut stuck on there with the fonts. And I figured I just need to mask off everything else with a little bit of paint and some other vinyl, some uncut vinyl. Throw it in the electro etch, and this is just a 12-volt battery. Mix up some salt water, drop it in there. And again, I'm just working in the dark. I have a little bit of experience, but I never etched this type of brass. And remember I said how impure this brass was? It was bits and pieces of bullets, keys, everything. So now it's about 4 hours later, and I realized I have a really deep etch, almost too deep. The etch started going up and under. I was checking it too. I kept checking it. It didn't seem deep enough, and then suddenly it was too deep. The etching went so deep that it went up and underneath the masking, which made some of the letters get too wide. It also revealed a lot of pits and porosity in the casting. So I decided to let me finish this bell out. At least we have a backup, but I had it in my mind to make a new one. So we have third try is somewhat successful. The etching looks like it's possible. You'll notice the etching kind of went between some of the masking. So I went back in actually, and I TIG welded in a little bit of filler here and there to get rid of a lot of the porosity. And so now I decided to make the mooring point for the top of the bell out of a chunk of brass. And I leave that stem on there, and I tap that stem with an exterior tap that's 3/4 16, I believe. And I'm able to use that to come down through the top of the bell, and the clapper is TIG welded to the bolt. So it's kind of engineering wise, it's working out pretty good. And I'm putting 2 flat spots on it so that it will accept the shackle. And the shackle now will be the point at which the bell will hang. And just some simple traditional Bridgeport techniques that I learned from my buddy Kevin. Thank you, Kevin. Now this is the clapper. In hindsight, after being at the ceremony and realizing, we ultimately used the second bell, not this one. Mike's going to keep this one in his shop. But I realized the clapper should have been much heavier. But that's why we do these things, you learn. And now I made the clapper there. And I drill a hole in it for the lanyard so you could pull and tug on it, and then a hole at the other end. And this is the bolt. This is the 3/4 inch bolt. I TIG weld on just a piece of wire. That's just TIG wire. And now that is going to be the dangly spot for the clapper. All goes together. Thinking through this engineering, a lot of these answers came to me right while I was in the moment. I was really focused on just getting a good casting, and I thought to myself, once I get through this casting process, I'll figure out all this later, and I did. And there it is. And it dings and it bings, but I had it in my mind, I got to do it one more time, and I did. And now I put all that learning, all that experience I just gathered over the previous 3 or 4 months, I buckled down, and in one day I made what you're looking at here. In one day I made this bell. I casted it in the morning, I put my mold together, I had some fresh petrabond and some of the used petrabond. You'll see that some of it is darker, that's got some burnt material in it. And I just went right to work. I didn't slow down, I tried not to show any fear, which is a huge part of the stall tactic, is just fear. Fear that you're going to mess up, you're going to waste your time, waste somebody else's time, waste materials, waste money. It is all just fear-based stall techniques. And I said, I am not going to let fear slow me down. And I made the mold, did a lot of the same things me and Mike did together. It worked that time. The only thing I need to remember this time is that when I pour it, I have to keep an eye on the vent hole. You learn from your mistakes. Once I see that the vent hole is filled with material, I know that we have a full cast. And now here I was a little nervous moving these around because I don't know if they're going to fall apart, but they stay together. So now I have that much more experience knowing I could pick up a huge chunk of petrabond and it's not going to fall apart. This time I bought brass on eBay, so I have actually bronze. I got pure bronze. Mike, my friend Mike, helped me pour this. This is all in the same day. Poured the mold, whacked it open. I knew I was going to have a good casting because I saw that the sprue filled up and the vent hole filled up. And okay, I was like on a good path. I was super excited. This looks great. Right to the lathe. This is just a couple of hours after that first clip in this segment. Went to town. Again, just using the grinder technique. I never even put a lathe cutter to it because I knew it would just pull it out of the 3-jaw chuck. I knew this time just drill that hole 3/4 of an inch. Last time I didn't know what I was doing. So this time I put a bolt hole in there, go to town on the details. I took some time off camera and TIG welded in a couple of holes that needed to be filled in. I TIG welded it in with silicone bronze. And now this is our body of our bell. It came out really good. I was very happy with it. Now it's time to electro etch it. There I made the shackle hold. Again, same technique as I did before. And I go back to the technique, but this time I was able to incorporate the curve. I wrapped it with a piece of paper, drew the lines on it with a Starrett scraping tool so that I can get it nice and level. Pulled off that piece of paper, brought it into Illustrator, and I was able to wrap the font on those curves. And now here we are. We have a pretty decent etch. It's not as deep as the other one because it's a different material. I was able to pull it off, and the etch is very shallow, but very effective and very crisp. There was a couple of problems. I was able to use solder this time. I filled them back in with solder, and I went in with the Dremel tool and ground out some of the solder to define the font between the date, actually the date specifically, but there you could see up close. You see between the 2 and the 3, I had to fill that in with solder. In the end, I was so focused on trying to get a good casting, I didn't realize that when I typed out the vinyl cut, I spelt Nargolet with 2 T's. It's on the last 2 bells. Complete amateur mistake, but everybody at the club thought it was funny, and they really, really, really were happy with the final results and the story that I messed up the spelling. They said leave it. I'm going to make a 4th one, 5th one with the correct etching, and then I'm going to bring it over to the club. But thank you, Mike. Thanks for pushing me this hard to get all this learning in. Thank you. And thank you to the New York Explorers Club for this opportunity.